Hi, my name is Will, and this is Eulexia Languages. And Michel Thomas, who I'm going to talk about today, I hear that he gets a lot of hate online, and so I think somebody needs to come to his defense and give him a fair shake. And so today I'm going to talk about who he is. First off, he's a fascinating character. You should look into him just on the basis of what he has done, his achievements, and what he has claimed to have done. And there's some controversy about that, but we can talk about it. So he was born with a different name in Poland, and he had these stories during World War II that were kind of unbelievable. He grew up in Poland, but he was educated in first Germany, but then anti-Semitism drove him to France. And then during World War II, he claims to have escaped several concentration camps, became a member of the French underground, and then became an intelligence officer and an interrogator in the U.S. Army. Now, of these things, I know for a fact that he has a Silver Star from the U.S. Army. So that is something we can confirm. And when he was done with the Army, he became a Nazi hunter and talks about that and writes about it in one of his books. But what he's most known for is that he was the language teacher of the stars, that he had this method of teaching languages, and the people who had the means to afford his classes, I think they were like $300 an hour, would take his classes. And so he became the language teacher of, say, Grace Kelly, Francois Truffaut, Alfred Hitchcock, Peter Sellers, Doris Day, who he claims in one of his courses that he helped her come up with the idea for que sera, sera, what will be, will be. Stephen Fry, who's known as being somebody very interested in language and in the English language in particular. Eddie Izzard, who's also known as being multilingual. He's done stand-up comedy in French, which is quite an achievement, but Michel Thomas was his teacher. He's also done videos on Old English, which are kind of interesting, where he learned Old English and went to speak to somebody who was West Frisian. So he's speaking Old English to a West Frisian, and they could understand each other somewhat. So interesting guy. Taught Max von Sydow, who, if you look into him, he knows many languages, was originally a Swedish movie star, but we have seen him today in movies. Bill Murray. He spoke French in a couple movies, and he lived in France after he became a big star in Ghostbusters. Emma Thompson talks about Michel Thomas and her 12-hour-a-day sessions with him that she found to be exhilarating. And so that's one of the things about Michel Thomas is everything about his program runs right in the face of everything we know. And one of those things is you can learn for 12 hours a day. So one of his students, I think, John le Carré, the guy who wrote Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, came to his defense when all these things were coming up that people claimed that he didn't live the life that he lived, that he was making these claims about his extraordinary lifetime. And he said that as a former intelligence officer himself at that time, that he found his stories to be completely credible. And on top of that, here's one thing about his credibility. One, he has the Silver Star, but two, if you look at his program, it is extraordinary. What he was able to do is, I think, if you really dig into what he did, I've been obsessed with trying to figure out how he came up with this idea and how he's able to structure it so well. It just, as a teacher, it blows me away. And was a big inspiration for me in becoming a linguist and in studying linguistics. And my big thing was I wanted to figure out what this guy was doing. And I thought if I studied linguistics in college, I'd find the answer. Unfortunately, I didn't. But yeah, let's move on. So let's talk about him as a teacher. A couple of his quotes that he has about his kind of philosophy. One is, the first time I ever heard this, it astounded me, and I fell in love with the guy immediately. There are no bad students. There are only bad teachers. All right. I heard this again through Siegfried Engelmann, who was the creator of direct instruction, which I think is an amazing methodology for teaching, say, math or literacy or writing or lots of other things. So Siegfried Engelmann and direct instruction quote. The quotes are very similar. He says, if you ain't teaching, or if the student ain't learning, you ain't teaching. And so there are no bad students, only bad teachers. Siegfried Engelmann kind of talks about that as well. Another thing I think is a kind of profound insight is Michel Thomas's insistence that people don't memorize things, that his whole program is based on understanding. And he says, what you understand, you know, and what you know, you don't forget. And I talked about this with my students in a lot of different areas, but students are always obsessed with memorizing certain facts. But it's like, if you can learn the principles behind the facts, then you won't need to remember because you can just run it through in your mind and come to the conclusion again. All right. For example, we might learn times tables up to 12, and we should learn times tables, but we don't need to learn times tables up to, say, 38. It just is not as useful once we get there. And if we know the principle of multiplication, we don't need it. Same thing with addition. If we don't need to memorize what 57 plus 683 is, because we'll never see it, but also because if we understand the principles behind addition and arithmetic, then we can figure out the answer whenever we need to. So we don't need to memorize things necessarily. And if we understand them, it turns out that it's easier to memorize things anyway. They become part of ourselves. So let's talk about his structure and his programs. And I'm going to be talking about his audio programs that he released shortly before his death. In his mid-80s, I think he was very secretive about what he was doing, but he kind of wanted to leave a legacy, is what I think. And so he recorded programs for Spanish, French, German, and Italian, and then trained a protege named Harold Goodman to do, who ended up doing a Mandarin course. And so he was very secretive, and all we have left that I can find is his programs. There was also a school that he had, and there's a little bit about that I've heard, but I'm not really sure how true it is. You can kind of hear it from Harold Goodman in some of his interviews. But as far as his structure of his courses, he takes a very strong linguistic approach. He is using functional linguistics and using them in a way that lay people can understand. It's all comparative. So he takes the mother tongue of the student and he works with the mother tongue in order to draw out the foreign language that is the target. And so it's a bilingual method, and it works a lot with cognition, comparative analysis between the languages and cognition in a way that is not overwhelmingly technical. Like, he doesn't really use grammar. He doesn't talk about grammar, except for in a very basic way. The class that we have in the audio recordings, he has 2 students, and you are the 3rd student. So the 2 students are learning the language in his foundational course. They're beginners. It would seem absolute beginners. And so he's teaching them, and you listen to them go through it, and you pause it, and you try to figure out the answers before they come to it. And then you listen to their answers, and then you listen to him do his error handling or repeat the sentence if it was a correct sentence. So it's a pretty interesting way. You're literally watching him and listening to him teach a class, and then you're kind of a participant if you follow the instructions. He doesn't give answers to questions. He gives you inductive, semi-communicative exercises. So he'll tell you a certain feature of the language, like in French, c'est means it is, and all words that end in IBLE many words in English that end in IBLE are the same in French, but pronounced ible. So how would you say, for example, it is possible? C'est possible. And he builds that way. He never gives you the answer. He asks that you come to the answer, and after you come to the correct answer, he will reinforce it with his more or less accurate pronunciation. He is Polish, and he does have a Polish accent in English, and from the French speakers I've heard write about him say he has a Polish accent as well. But his whole idea is you should be learning to communicate. So you can let's do that. That's the fun part. Nobody else can teach like him, so there you go. Rules. He has these certain rules for the class, which are non-negotiables. And as somebody who's taught, I really like these rules, and I think they're very useful. One of the first shocking rules you get is no taking notes at all. There is nothing going to be visual. You're not going to get any written words on the board or anything like that. It's all auditory for one. But even if it weren't auditory, he's not going to be writing out words for you. He doesn't want you to look at it. And I think that's genius, because one of the hardest things for me when I was first learning languages was that I would see a word and it had a spelling of which I had a certain automatic association to the English. So, for example, I remember trying to learn how to say what was spelled C-A-O in Chinese. And so it would be pronounced something like, or a C-A-I, so like food. And it was spelled C-A-I. It was hard for me to break the habit of saying something like Kai or K. Maybe I was saying at the time K, because A-I says A, K. But then having to restructure my brain to be able to read it as the correct, like, tsai, because the C says t. And being able to put that at the beginning of a word, too, is also difficult. So there's all sorts of complexity when you introduce the alphabetic system, when you already have a competing alphabetic system in your mind that you've mastered and developed to automaticity. So he gets rid of all that, says, we're not going to do any of that. But at the same time, he did have utility for it. He would ask, how would you spell these words? He would bring reference to the spellings of words to talk about morphology. So, for example, in those first lessons, IBLE says ible, and A always says ah. So how would you pronounce ABLE? Able. Good. Now how would you spell probable? PROBABLE. And how would you pronounce it? Probable. Right? And so he's using what you know about the spelling, but he doesn't want you to look at it. And the ear comes before the eye in languages. Is something you talk about for a while. So that's one of the rules. Another rule is no homework. And this is essential. No homework at all. And the reason, he doesn't explain any of this, and he's very mysterious about his ways, but what I think the reason is when you start doing this program, you get the idea that you can do a lot of things, and you're really good at it. And so you're going to try to apply things into new circumstances that you haven't been taught yet. And you're going to start making misapprehensions. You're going to misunderstand what the language, what you're trying to do with the language. And you're going to run into all sorts of obstacles, which in his program, he has already identified and worked into the program. So you have to get through the whole program. And he would say, no homework until then. But as soon as you're done with the program, then you're going to pick up a book and you're going to start reading. You're going to read as much as you can. All right, so that was another part of the program. Another one is don't try to memorize anything. He says specifically, your remembering is my business. As the teacher, you shouldn't be trying to do anything. You should just be trying to answer my questions, thinking through them calmly. Don't worry about how much time it takes, but we want you to run through the neurological processes of getting these correct answers, and then focus on things like pronunciation. Like make sure you're making a good pronunciation and intonation, especially in Spanish where it's so important. We need to get the correct stress on the correct syllable. And so there's so many things that could be going through your mind. Your cognitive load is really high in learning a language, especially when you're doing the complex things he's doing. And so he wants to limit that as much as possible. These exercises are not communicative. You're not going to be trying to express your opinions or ideas. You're going to be learning how to express your opinions or ideas. But mostly he's going to take away all the process that goes into thinking about what you want to say, to reacting and trying to find the linguistic structures to say what you want to say. He's going to take all that out. You can do that later after you've mastered the program. So I think those are some interesting rules that are very different some ways. A lot of teachers will tell you don't do homework in like high school classes, but or don't try to learn anything on your own. Just work with our set vocabulary list. But they do that in service of like communicative approaches, which I think I understand why. I just don't think it's a good way. All right. Pace. You're going to be going through this in a rapid pace. The whole program for the French is 14 hours, and then there's also the review programs, which are like I think 4 hours in total. But there's only 14 hours, and in that 14 hours, you're going to be going through the entire scope and sequence, which is essentially the entire like basic grammar of the language. You're going to learn all of the conjugations in French, and in Spanish, I don't know if he uses like the past. What's it called? The past imperfect in the subjunctive. I'm not sure about that. He might, but he's going to go over as much of the languages as really necessary for you to be able to be liberated, so you can start teaching yourself from that moment. He inoculates you from misapprehensions, and then you can go in and read books and start noticing different patterns. He tells you how to read books as well, to the maximal effect for language learning, which is great. Okay, so the methods. Again, semi-communicative drills. We're not going to be thinking about what we want to answer. He's not interested in like, what do you want for lunch? And then you thinking about, well, I want to eat this for lunch and how to say that. No, we're going to go over the entire structure of the language in a very, very systematic way with lots of interleaved learning. So we're going to learn something. We're going to forget about it. We're going to come back later and hit it again and in new context, new environments. So constantly like kind of reviewing things that you've already like gotten in your mind, and then expanding the domain of possibility within words. So, like, for example, just in the first 10 minutes or so, you learn something like in French, ce n'est pas. And he teaches you it is c'est, and then it is not is ce n'est pas. And then he tells you that pas at the end, that means not. And so he's already taught you, like, for me. And so how would you say not for me? Pas pour moi. All right. And so you're expanding what that pas is possible, what's possible with that, as well as like the pour moi. And there's no context, there's no linguistic context, but it's kind of fun as you go through the program to like invent linguistic contexts. And he seems to get some pleasure in giving linguistic contexts that are that kind of point to certain funny ideas and certain funny circumstances that you probably wouldn't think of, and you wouldn't think of this being like useful within language learning, especially right off the bat. But then it brings to your attention what it is you're doing when you're communicating. One of the things I just love about the Michel Thomas method is that it really demystified what it is that we do when we speak language. It brought my attention to all sorts of things I never thought about, and it made me interested, and it made me so I wasn't intimidated anymore by language. All the grammar is explained with like just very simple rules that you can follow, and then the exceptions to those rules, of course. But they're taught in such a way that it's like, oh, okay, I get this, and I'm not afraid of like looking at this, and it led me into going into linguistics. So. And as I was doing the linguistics, I could see what exactly he was doing, how complex and sophisticated his methods were, and then just being baffled, like, how did he come up with this? It's crazy. All right. Okay. You get some mnemonics. He's not above using mnemonics to get you to memorize certain things. One of his mnemonic rules I love is the nose rule for Spanish, and I think he invented this, but the nose rule has to do with the expected stressed syllable. Whenever I talk to, like, I have a friend who has a master's degree in the Spanish language, and he's always talking about the 3 or 4 different syllable types and stressed within syllable. There's like 3 words for it. Adrugía or something like that. I forget exactly what it is, but he doesn't use any of those words. You don't need those. Okay, what you need is the nose rule. The nose rule tells you that that if a word ends in a vowel like OE in nose or N or S, that we should assume that the stress syllable is going to be on the penultimate syllable. Okay, so the nose rule, and he explains how to do that. And then whenever that nose rule is broken, you're going to get an accent marker. All right? So like in 2 minutes, you can really learn this rule, and it's extremely important going forward in Spanish. So mnemonics, let's see, was there any other mnemonics? Oh, another rule he has is the Cecily rule. And so the Cecily rule I never knew about, but I learned it when I started teaching literacy, phonics. But they don't have that rule there. But the rule says basically, if you have a C followed by E, I, or Y, it's always going to say S. All right, and that plays for English, and it plays for French, and not for Spanish? No, and also for Spanish. In European Spanish, like the Cecilia rule. But so he has these mnemonics that he uses, and they're useful. But it's not based on mnemonics. A lot of people who misinterpret his method think it's all about mnemonics and learning a vast system of complex things. No, he gives you a rule. You apply the rule, you master it, and then you forget about the rule, essentially. That's what it's for. It's all about getting you to a point where you're fluent and articulating correctly and getting everything right from the beginning, and also doing complex things. The pace is really fast. So, for example, you get, within the first hour of instruction in the French program, you get the phrase that you have to inductively come to the answer of. What impression do you have of the economic and political situation in France at present? If you told somebody you're going to be doing that in the first hour, they'd be like, oh, well, I'm just going to memorize some words. It's like, no, you're going to figure out how to say this based on a few simple rules. And it's like, that's not possible. But when you do it, it's such an amazing experience. And yeah. Okay, so engineered mistakes. Okay, the number one lesson he has, like little part of a lesson that he has that is an engineered mistake. I just think it's so masterful. And looking at it as a teacher and as a linguist, he has a rule that he's been teaching, but you haven't mastered it yet. You have to keep it in mind. And that rule is there in English, we have like, I am going. They are going. They are eating. Whatever. We have these, what do you call them? The progressive aspect. But those don't exist in French or in Spanish, really. In Spanish, you can argue, but we'll just say it doesn't. In French, it certainly does not. And so in French, he builds up like, it is good, it is possible, c'est bon, c'est possible. He gets you really used to saying this c'est. And then he finally gets to a point where he teaches you je voudrais parler, I would like to speak. But now, how do we say I speak or I am speaking? Je parle. And he builds it up so that you start conjugating this and it feels natural. And then he introduces like it. And so how would you say it speaks? Ça parle. Good. How would you say it marches? Ça marche. And how would you say it is going? And so you get something like, or it is speaking. And then you say, well, c'est, because c'est means it is. And then you get confused because you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Because like this foundational thing for the English language is we have these progressive aspects and we have like the dummy do's in the language, which confuse us. And when we're learning a foreign language, they're so fundamental to the way we think about language that it needs to be broken down and reassembled for us. And when he brings in like ça va, it is going, ça va bien. When he finally teaches that, which is, by the way, something often taught in the first lesson in traditional programs, ça va, just tells you like, oh, I'm fine, ça va. He's actually teaching you what it means. And when you realize exactly what ça va means, it's like, oh, I studied French before and I heard this and I never once even occurred to me to think about what it is that these words actually mean. And my teacher never would teach me. So that was another moment where I just was blown away. So you get these unanalyzed chunks that are eventually reanalyzed, and there's like a light bulb that goes off. For example, voulez-vous, he'll just teach you that means do you want, or will you, as in will you please, voulez-vous. But then eventually he's going to say, well, voulez actually has a meaning. And so when you say voulez-vous, do you want, the voulez kind of means want. And so do you want is voulez-vous, and vous means you. How would you say you want? Instead of do you want, how would you say you want? And then you're working through it and you're like, okay, well, the vous just goes first and then say voulez, vous voulez. So now you're taking unanalyzed chunks that you've become proficient in articulating and saying them within fluent contexts and then reanalyzing it and learning how it works. I don't know. It's amazing. Okay. And then the reading part. When you finished all the program, you really need to start reading. And he tells you what kind of books to read. Tells you how to read them. You don't want to pick up a dictionary and like try to figure out every single word. If you see a word like 5 times, that's an important word. Look it up. If you can't understand a whole paragraph based on the context, look that up in a dictionary. But really, you want to be paying attention and really focusing on what it is that you can understand. Read something that's familiar to you. Read comic books and interviews. He doesn't say comic books. He says interviews. I say comic books because in French it's really useful. You can avoid that historic past that people don't speak. So teaching you how to approach that, which is really in line with like Kato Lam's method of learning, but he gives you all the tools to do what probably took Kato Lam a long time to figure out. All over grammatical studies, all that. He gives you all the tools. He teaches you all the grammar that you need to know in a functional way without a bunch of terminology. And it's really good. All right, the sequence of the programs. He has... Actually, let's go to the programs first. These are the programs he has before he died. He was in his 80s when he made them. There's the French, which I think is the best. That's why I put it at number 1. Spanish, I think, is also really good. I put it at 2. 3 is Italian. 4 is German. I think German was the least successful of the ones he taught, although it's great. It's wonderful. It is... I didn't get as far with German as I was able to with like Spanish or Italian by the German one. I think German is just a little bit more complicated than the others, which is probably controversial to say. Now, Mandarin is under the Michel Thomas brand, but it wasn't taught by Michel Thomas. It was taught by a student after Michel Thomas died. And Harold Goodman, I think, did a pretty good job, an admirable job. He really seems to want to know like how to teach this stuff, but I think he gets caught up in like being cute. Michel Thomas will say things that are really clever and funny, and you find yourself maybe laughing when he tells these stories, and you remember what he says. Harold Goodman leans into that a little bit too much, and then when I don't know, it's a good program, and I'd recommend it. But I don't think it has the artistry that, say, the Michel Thomas programs have, and particularly that French one. All the other Michel Thomas courses, like Japanese, Russian, Arabic, are not taught by Michel Thomas, and the people who created those programs, I don't think had any idea what Michel Thomas was doing. So you can see like a skeleton of the method through those programs, but I don't really recommend them. What I would recommend is a program called Language Transfer, the thinking method, languagetransfer.org. You can find it there. I know the guy wants to distance himself from Michel Thomas, but I've been following this guy for a while, and he's obviously inspired by Michel Thomas, and I think he maybe is ideologically opposed to Michel Thomas, who would charge $300 an hour for his lessons, and he was definitely into making money. But Language Transfer, this guy offers these courses for free because he wants to help the world. He wants to change the world, and it's a noble project. I've listened to his Spanish program a little bit. Seems okay. I would really recommend looking into it. As far as a free version of like what Michel Thomas does, I think he's got his head in the right place. He's a Greek guy, so when he teaches the Spanish, you get Greek accent a little bit. But he kind of does the same program as Michel Thomas, except for he just has one student instead of two. Under here, I also have crossed out Paul Noble. Paul Noble was a student of Michel Thomas, so I hear. I don't know any of these things for sure about Paul Noble, but the consensus I get and what I've heard is that he was a student of Michel Thomas, and that he basically stole Michel Thomas's program and produced his own method, essentially, which is the Michel Thomas method, under his own name, and he never gives any credit to Michel Thomas. And that was the reason Michel Thomas was really secretive and didn't leave us a lot to look at, because he was afraid somebody would steal his method and pass it off as their own. Because he never got credit for what he did either. There was like one, I think like a 60 Minutes on him, about his work, and he was secretive, didn't want anybody to see what he was doing. But Paul Noble seems to be, Michel Thomas's nightmare. So we just have these scraps of what he has left for us. But those scraps are wonderful. I think it's worth looking into. I should also say that you're not going to learn the language entirely from listening to these programs. It's not designed for that. When you finish the programs, say if you mastered every little part of it, the whole way through, including the builder programs, when you pick up a book and start reading, you might understand like 20%, maybe even 15%. But it gives you the tools to start incorporating all those things. You don't get a bunch of vocabulary. He avoids vocabulary. He gives you enough of certain categories of words, like monovalent, bivalent, and trivalent, like verbs, in order for you to know how they work, so that when you find them in the real world, you'll know how to use them. You'll know how to play with them. So that might be one reason that people tend to trash on Michel Thomas, is like, well, is that it? Well, that's not enough. I don't speak the language now. It's like, well, that's not what it's intended for. It's intended to give you enough of the tools so you can learn on your own, which I think is wonderful, and that's what teachers should do. And also to inspire you and give you a love for what it is you're doing as a language learner and as a human being, as a person who uses language. The fundamental thing that humans do is use language, and it's a miracle, and it's beautiful. And if you go through Michel Thomas's programs, I think you'll find that. You'll find a way to better appreciate how beautiful and amazing and miraculous it is that we speak languages. So, cheers. Thank you. I'd love to hear anything you have in the comments. If you throw any shade on Michel Thomas, I'm gonna respond. So, have a great day. Cheers.